Welcome to Can You Survive? A top-down run-and-gun shooter where players fight against an endless horde of enemies to see not only how much points they can accumulate, but how long can they survive. Players will spend their time running, shooting, and outsmarting the enemy. The goal? Survive as long as you possibly can. So the game begins with the player starting at a random set location on the map. The map itself will also begin on a random layout. The idea is to have one large map that alters every 2 minutes, closing off certain sections and opening up others. The rules are relatively simple. Don't get hit. If the player comes into contact with an enemy, then the player loses. To prevent this from happening, the player will have the ability to shoot. They will be able to run and fire at the same time, including the ability to fire in all directions, but that also comes with a price. When the player moves about the map, the player's speed will be swift compared to that of the enemy. The trade-off begins when the player starts to fire. As the player fires a primary weapon, their speed will decrease, allowing the horde to reach the player quicker. Stop firing, and the rate returns back to normal. But shooting is not the only means of survival. There will be times when the player will need to decide between fighting his way through a horde or taking a different route and attempt shooting back towards the enemy instead. As players continue to survive, the enemy horde will only grow larger, making it harder and harder with each passing second for the player to survive. Since running and shooting are the only two options available to survive, and one has to be stronger than the other. So to do this, the player will have power-ups that will help ease that burden. But these power-ups also offer trade-offs. The game will include two unique types, special and single use. Special power-ups, when picked up, will serve as a secondary weapon for the player to use and will remain until it gets swapped with a different special power-up, so only one type can be carried at a time. An example will be the cannon. The player will be able to destroy large quantities of enemies at once, but must sacrifice movement for 5 seconds while the weapon charges up. Now, the single-use power-up is in the name. These will not hinder the player in any way, but instead assist them greatly. An example is the barrier pickup. The barrier allows the player to cut off a horde from a path to allow them time to thin out a different horde. The wall will only hold until the hit points reach 0. Upon being destroyed, the barrier disappears, and the horde will continue chasing the player. Another antagonizing force is the map itself. With the map mutating every 2 minutes, a passageway that was once open could potentially become a death trap. Now, similar games to be considered are a Smash TV and Pac-Man blend. Two top-down shooters where one has the player taking down waves of enemies and the other challenging the player to collect pellets while avoiding 4 goals to complete the level. What makes Can You Survive unique is the fact that there will never be a pause in the game, so the horde will constantly bombard the player. With each passing second, the player will encounter an increasing number of enemies, but every 2 minutes when the map layout changes, so will the number of enemies. This spike will not only augment the difficulty, but expand the challenge, ultimately putting the name of the game to the test. But what are the risks? Well, a game even as simple as this one can prevent its fair share. One of which is trying to figure out how to successfully set up enemy spawn locations as the map changes and develops. The idea is to have enemies spawn only in the layout that the player is currently in and not in the area that's closed off. All that's going to do is flood the closed off sections to the point where the minute it becomes open, the player will become overwhelmed with enemies, potentially creating a challenge so severe that it'll deter the player from playing the game, and that is not what we want. This can easily be fixed by having the enemies that are cut off from the player to be destroyed, but then again, trying to get that coded will also be a challenge as well. This was my game, and I hope you enjoyed it.